Well, let us begin then with the oath. The Secretary of State first, if you please.
Please state your full name.
Matthew John David Hancock.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. Vineall.
Please state your full name.
William Graham Robert Vineall.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Yes, Miss Richards.
Mr. Hancock, you've been Secretary of State for Health and Social Care since the 8th of July 2018, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you'd not, I think, previously served as a minister within the Department of Health, but your various previous ministerial roles did include a year in the role now occupied by Penny Mordaunt as Paymaster General.
Yes, just under a year.
Now, in broad terms, is this right? Your role and responsibilities as Secretary of State for Health mean that you have, under National Health Service legislation, ministerial responsibility to Parliament for the provision of the health service in England.
I have the responsibility of the provision of health services in England, but I also have responsibility for the health of the UK as a whole, although, of course, the provision of healthcare is devolved in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Now, if we just look at one document, it'll come up on the screen in front of you, showing that it's WITN 4688004. This is described as the framework agreement between the Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS Business Services Authority. And if we go, please show me to page 7, we can see. I'm sorry, Shami, could we go 2 pages further on? My apologies. We just look at the top paragraph on that page under the heading Accountability, Secretary of State. This tells us that the Secretary of State is accountable to Parliament for the health and social care system. Its steward is how you're there described, including NHS BSA. And NHS BSA, for present purposes, is the administrator of the English Infected Blood Support Scheme.
Yes, that's a very good description of it, yes.
We can take that down, thank you. What role do other ministers within the Department of Health and Social Care have in terms of responsibility for or involvement in the issues with which this inquiry is concerned?
Well, the junior minister responsible for this area took decisions in my time as Secretary of State for the detail of the work that we've needed to do and that I've wanted us to do to bring the systems across the 4 nations more to parity. The principal responsibility, I'd say, for ministerial decision-making in the name of the Secretary of State has been taken by junior ministers. But as the document correctly describes, I am the steward of the system as a whole, and therefore I take responsibility for everything that happens in the department. In some cases, for a big decision, I would be cited on it after a junior minister has decided it in order for me to be content with the decision. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask me about all decisions, but I will be able to answer that which I know. There's a level of detail in which I don't get into because I have such a broad range of responsibilities.
And indeed, that in part is why we have Mr. Vineall here as well, who may be able to assist on some of the more granular points. And just in terms of personnel, in terms of ministers, Jackie Doyle-Price was the junior minister dealing with this area between June 2017 and July 2019, and then the current junior minister is Nadine Dorries.
That's correct, yes.
When you took up your role in July 2008 as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, what, if anything, did you know and understand about the suffering experienced by those infected with hepatitis and HIV through infected blood and blood products?
Well, I knew that this had been a tragedy that had happened in the past. I knew that there was an ongoing concern that the failures of the state had not been properly acknowledged. I had a broad but not a detailed understanding of the consequences of the tragedy of the infected blood for individuals and their families. I knew, of course, that the Prime Minister had set up, the then Prime Minister had set up this inquiry, but I was not across any of the details with respect to support schemes or how that might have, or the impact of that. But I did have this sense, and I have it today, and this guides my actions as Secretary of State, that many people felt, and I'm sure many people still feel, that the government needs to make sure that exactly what happened and the consequences of it are fully uncovered, and that those of us that are in positions of responsibility ensure that all past actions and decisions in this area are scrutinised, and perhaps even more than that, that we acknowledge, even though I obviously wasn't involved in the 70s and 80s, that we acknowledge, in my role as Secretary of State, I acknowledge the pain and the suffering, not only of the errors that led to this harm on people's lives, but also a sense that redress wasn't properly considered, and that people felt their voices weren't heard. And I want to make sure those voices are heard. And so whilst I wasn't the minister responsible for the details, I was determined that the direction and the work of the department would be to be fully transparent, open, ensure that all the history could be accessed, and crucially, that we should try to reach a fair support scheme for the future. And I hope that we can do that.
The inquiry has heard extremely harrowing accounts of physical, psychological and emotional harm, harrowing accounts of lives destroyed, lives lost. To what extent has that information and the sense of quite how horrific the experiences people have undergone have been, to what extent has that been relayed to you as Secretary of State by your officials?
Well, I understand that, and that has been relayed, although not suffering directly myself. It is hard to imagine the consequence of that, especially because so many people had their lives cut short or ruined by something completely outside of their control. When they were given a medical procedure, perhaps a transfusion, all sorts of different medical procedures that led to this enormous and terrible consequence for them. I've been told about that by my officials. I've also seen direct testimony, and my two junior ministers, Jackie Doyle-Price and then Nadine Dorries, have both been obviously heavily involved, and I talked to them about it.
Mr. Vineall, can I just turn to you again by way of some introductory questions? You're a senior civil servant within the Department of Health and Social Care, and your title is Director of NHS Quality, Safety and Investigations at the department.
That's correct.
And you've been in that position since 2016.
That's right.
Prior to that, did you hold any roles within the department or elsewhere that are relevant to the evidence that you're providing to the inquiry?
No, I didn't hold any roles relevant.
What does being Director of NHS Quality, Safety and Investigations entail? What's the remit of your directorate?
Well, I suppose that the simplest way of putting it is we're responsible for issues of NHS policy that aren't workforce and aren't to do with throughput and waiting lists, but are about clinical conditions, are about litigation, are about investigations and inquiries, are about handling judicial reviews in the department and the analytical work that goes with that. And obviously we're responsible for quality and safety policy. And within that area of policy, we sponsor a number of organisations. So we oversee on the department, on the Secretary of State's behalf, a number of organisations, including the Care Quality Commission and NHS Resolution, used to be known as the NHS Litigation Authority. And that group of responsibilities is divided up into 5 branches of about 15 or 20 people each and a set of analysts, so about 110 to 115 staff at any one time. And that's what my director role encompasses.
And how does your role or the role of that directorate interact, for example, with the work of the Blood Policy Unit, or what certainly I think used to be called the Blood Policy Unit within the department?
Well, we would take advice from them if there were any specific issues of blood policy that were relevant to this issue. Until a couple of years ago, the blood policy and the responsibility for EBS and the response to the inquiry was together, and that was separated when I took over at the start of 2019 because we felt it was better that we had the support for this inquiry and the servicing of it entirely separate from any other policy issues, to make sure that it was entirely accountable and clear in terms of how we were going up to the inquiry. And we took on board the EBS responsibility because that's, in a sense, the most live issue in terms of how the Business Services Authority relates to us on this issue. And we also put it together, to be perfectly honest, because we knew that the inquiry was going to be interested in EBS. So we thought if we knew what the inquiry was doing and we had responsibility for EBS together, then that would make for a more responsive package. And although it is fortuitous, I've never worked on the public health side of the department. So I'd never had any involvement with any decisions before I picked up this role at the end of 2018.
So prior to responsibility for EBS sitting within your directorate, it was managed through the Blood Policy Unit.
Correct.
When you took on that role in relation to EBS, what was your knowledge and understanding of what had happened and the suffering and experiences of those who would be the beneficiaries of EBS?
Well, it was fairly limited. I knew from being a teenager in the 1980s that this had been, a big problem and an issue and hadn't been resolved. And I suppose as a regular official in the department, I knew that there were ongoing issues about support and the whole question about whether the ex gratia payments were appropriate in their response. So they were the two things that I knew. I wasn't au fait with any of the detail when I picked up the role.
And how has your knowledge and understanding of what people have actually lived through, died from, how has that deepened or changed over the subsequent years?
Sorry. Well, I read the Penrose report. That was the first thing I was given to read. It obviously gave me some of the background. And I went in January 2019 to the meeting that David Liddington chaired with Jackie Doyle-Price. And that left a pretty clear impression on me, aside from the policy issues, about some of the circumstances of people who'd been infected and affected by infected blood. And I suppose I took 3 things away from that first meeting, which was there was a lot of suffering and hardship that was evident, first of all. People wanted more recognition than they were getting. And thirdly, which we'll probably come on to later, we needed to do things as quickly as we could because it was a group of people who were growing older. And then obviously over time, in terms of my day-to-day job, I've become more acquainted with the issues, and obviously I've watched some of the testimonies that have come through this inquiry to sort of understand the impact that these things have on people's lives.
Now, I'm going to ask next some questions about the origins of the English Infected Blood Support Scheme. That decision-making predates your appointment, Mr. Hancock. It obviously also predates you taking over, Mr. Vineall, responsibility for EBS. But you've exhibited to your statement and helpfully set out in your statement some aspects of the history. So there's just a handful of matters I want to touch on, Mr. Vineall, with you, if I may. I want to ask you to look at two documents, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the issues. Shomik, could we have, please, WITN 4688013? This is headed Briefing on Consultation to Reform Current Payment Schemes for PSPH, call with DAs on the 20th of January. The year isn't given, but I think we can date it as January 2016 from what else is set out.
I think it is.
And just so that everyone can understand, DAs refers to devolved administrations. Would that be right?
That's correct, yeah, sorry.
And PSPH?
Is the minister in charge at the time.
So that would have been Jackie Doyle-Price?
It wouldn't have been Jackie Doyle-Price then. It would have been probably Jane Ellison, because you'll see her signature on other letters at the time. But it was the equivalent role.
Yes, thank you. And then if we just, we can see this is some, as it were, some headline points, briefing points for the Minister. We see if we pick it up 4 bullet points down, it says, my officials have I know been working with their counterparts in each of the devolved administrations and have been sharing thinking as well as proposals where possible. And then we can date this because we can see 2 bullet points further down, the announcement of consultation on reform of the current payment schemes will be made in the House, and I think we know that was January 2016. If we look at the bottom of the page, under the heading Proposals, we can see there is then reference to funding in the spending review for those infected in England only, and then it says officials have also discussed, we go over the page, that following reform, Westminster will no longer be funding HIV payments in the devolved administrations. I'll come back to that later, Mr. Vineall. And then we see 2 bullet points down. In essence, we're proposing to replace the current 5 schemes with one operated by a single body. I would like this to be UK-wide, and I'm seeking your agreement on this. Now, is the correct way to understand this, in terms of the use of pronouns, is that the expression of I would like this to be UK-wide is the Minister's expression, and this is what she will be seeking agreement from the devolved administrations on that.
Yes, I think that's right. It's the only way you can read it.
And then if we look, so that's January 2016, shortly before the consultation was announced. If we then go, please, Shomik, to WITN 3953052. This is the government's response to the consultation, and we can see the date July 2016 in the bottom right-hand corner. Shomik, can we go to page 17, please? So we can see there, Chapter 3, the elements of the reformed system. If we just pick it up in the 3rd paragraph, there'll be a single scheme administrator combining the functions of the existing schemes into a simple scheme going forward. The administrator will become operational in the financial year 2017-18. The elements of the reformed scheme during the spending review period until the end of March 2021 will be, and then a number of details set out. And I'm not going to be asking about the details of the actual quantification of payments. We look at the bottom of the page. We can see it says all payments will continue to be ex gratia, which means they're funded voluntarily by government. And then if we go over the page, 3rd paragraph, still in the blue box, all elements of the above reform package apply to the current spending review period of 2016-17 to 2020-21, towards the end of which a review of the scheme will be undertaken. Now, just pausing there and putting to one side for a moment the announcements that were made in March of this year. Is it right to understand that what the government decided upon in mid-2016 was effectively a scheme that would last for 5 years, no particular promise or guarantee of funding beyond that period?
I don't know if that's the case or not. You could read it that way. The way I would read it is that we were going to establish a scheme with funding for initial 5 years to be reviewed at a subsequent spending round. That would be the typical interpretation of that statement.
And then if we go on then to page 25, if we pick it up towards the bottom of the page under the heading Consideration of UK-wide Elements, the reformed scheme set out, I think there's an "in" missing, and this document will apply to England only. The Scottish Government has already published its policy for scheme reform in Scotland. It will be for ministers in Wales and Northern Ireland to decide how to provide for the beneficiaries within their jurisdiction. So it would appear that between January and July of 2016, the preference for a UK-wide single scheme had altered, and there was now going to be, as we see announced here, national schemes, England having its own. Do you have any understanding of how and why that decision came to be taken, Mr. Vineall?
The simple answer is I don't understand how and why the decision was taken. The only things that I've gleaned from reading the documents are, as you said, by this period, Scotland had decided to have a separate scheme. And I think, what I said in my second statement, summative, was in this period, it became clear that, devolution meant that there would be most likely 4 schemes rather than 1, which is the contrast you're making from January. And in reading all the documents that you've exhibited, if you look in debates in 2015, a little bit into 2016, there's a little bit of discussion about that. And then, as you say, that ends, and we come to the position that you've described. That's as much as I know from reading the evidence. I don't know it from first-hand experience.
So in terms of who might be able to assist the inquiry with more direct knowledge, it would be, was it the junior minister with responsibility at the time, and then the head of the blood policy unit at the time?
Yeah, so it would be the junior minister, and it would be Ailsa White, who was one of my deputy director's predecessors, who was in the post for a long time.
It may be, in light of the evidence you've given, Mr. Vineall, that you can't assist with my next question, but it refers to a document you've exhibited, so I'm going to ask it in any event.
Okay.
WITN 4688016, please, Shomik. This is a letter from Jane Ellison, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Public Health at the time, to Shona Robertson, the Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government. And we can see from it she refers to having today published the government response. That's the document we've just looked at. Owing to the unique circumstances of this week, publication was moved forward at very short notice. Please accept my apologies for not giving you advance notice. And then we can see the footnote in handwriting at the end. Apologies that we could not give you more notice. It's been an unusual week, but happy to speak. The inquiry's already seen some evidence this week in relation to Northern Ireland that they did not have advance notice of this announcement. Are you able to assist us in understanding why the devolved administrations appear to have had little, if any, advance notice of this decision?
I don't know that, I'm afraid.
In general terms,
yes,
based upon your understanding or Mr. Hancock's understanding of how decisions are taken within the Department of Health,
yes,
would a decision of this kind, a decision to set up a single scheme relating to England, have been a decision taken by the junior minister or by the then Secretary of State, Mr. Hunt, or could it have been either?
I imagine it would have been taken, as Secretary of State described for himself, probably by the junior minister, but certainly telling and getting the approval of the Secretary of State, because obviously it's a relatively important decision, and it was, about respecting the devolution settlement.
In again, conscious as I am that you were not in post at the time, Mr. Vineall, but in looking at the material you've looked at for the purpose of providing your statement, And indeed in thinking about whatever you've gleaned since taking over responsibility
Yeah.
for EBS in 2019 or late 2018, are you able to assist us in understanding why an element of the new scheme involved means testing, which had been a very unpopular aspect of the Alliance House organisations?
Means testing had always been part of the arrangements in the Alliance House organisations. And when the new EBS scheme was set up in 2017, it effectively inherited most of the features of the Alliance House organisations, and then, you know, subsequently we started to reform those. So I think it was about, you know, there was more. The movement from the Alliance House organisations into EBS and the equivalent schemes was not reform and then change into the new system. It was effectively a lift and shift. And the one thing that came together, which is in my second statement, was obviously rather than beneficiaries being paid by a number of different organisations, the 5 Alliance House organisations for different elements, say in England, they were now paid from a single scheme administrator for those consolidated payments. And at the time, I mean, again, I don't know this, but it's in my statement, I don't know it firsthand, the schemes basically took on their inheritance and then started to look at those changes.
Is this right? And again, this is really looking to your general knowledge of how things, how decisions are taken, and indeed what you will have learned through being responsible for EBS since 2018. There was nothing, was there, that compelled the department to, as it were, lift and shift from the Alliance House organisations? It could have done something radically different. The reality is, as you've accurately described, it effectively pulled together many of the features of the Alliance House organisation schemes into a single one, rather than doing something radically different.
That's my understanding from the evidence I've seen.
And that must have been a choice. It's not something that would have been somehow forced upon the department.
No, it wouldn't have been. It would have been a decision for the department.
Can I turn then from the origins of EBS to what I think has probably been, until March of this year, the main change that was made during EBS's lifetime, and that was the announcement on the 30th of April 2019, whereby payments were increased.
Yeah.
So if we go, please, to WITN 4688032. Just to give us some background and context, so we can see it's an announcement by Jackie Doyle-Price on the 30th of April 2019. Today, the government have announced their intention to increase the financial support for beneficiaries of the Infected Blood Support Scheme in England, administered by the National Health Service Business Services Authority. And then there's reference to the January 2019 meeting. And then she says in the third paragraph, in this announcement, we've set out our plans for a major uplift in financial support available to infected and affected beneficiaries of the Infected Blood Support Scheme in England. Now, can you assist with this? I'm going to direct this first of all to you, Mr. Vineall. What's your understanding of why the decision was taken to make this change?
My understanding of the decision to make this, or why the decision was made to make this change, was obviously I was at the meeting in January 2019. Jackie Doyle-Price was there. Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, David Lidington, was there, and they were pretty impressed by the evidence that had been presented, and ministers wanted to make improvements to the England scheme and increase the amount of money in the scheme. And in broad terms, we were trying to match the levels paid to infected beneficiaries to Scotland, and Jackie Doyle-Price wanted to do something as quickly as possible, and that led to the announcement.
And was this a decision, Mr. Hancock, in which you were involved, as far as you can recall?
No, in fact, I know that I wasn't involved. I was the Secretary of State at DCMS at the time.
Well, then this is
19.
April 2019.
I was not involved in this. I delegated this work to Jackie Doyle-Price, and when I took over as Secretary of State, I delegated all work on this area in the details to Jackie Doyle-Price because she was well versed in it, and I trusted her judgment.
Is this a decision that would have come across your desk, as it were, for approval and
Yes.
so that you're cited of it?
So how this works is that in an area that I delegate to a junior minister, essentially the final decision would have come up to me to describe what the proposal was. I would normally get involved if there was a challenge in securing the funding from the Treasury, for instance, or if there were disagreements across Whitehall, and I wanted to support my junior minister in getting that agreed. In this instance, I can't recall being involved at all, and I would expect that to be because the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster was involved, and he was effectively Deputy Prime Minister at the time, and he will have ensured that clearance for this decision across Whitehall was made and straightforward.
We've heard some evidence this week from the other devolved administrations which suggests that they may not have been given advance notice of this, or much by way of advance notice of this, and were somewhat blindsided by it. Is that your understanding too, Mr. Vineall?
Yes, I'll explain what happened. So we weren't able to give advance notice. And the reason why we weren't able to give advance notice, which we would have liked to have done, was because the agreement for this announcement and the money that went with it was dependent on a number of other agreements that actually didn't have anything to do with infected blood, but were a part of a package of things that were being announced on that day or thereabouts. And therefore, in clearances terms, we weren't able to make the announcement until those other things were sorted out. And therefore we weren't able to give prior notice. So it was one of those unfortunate things that sometimes happens in government.
Is it right to understand that the funding for this was found from within the Department of Health's existing budget?
That's correct.
I think Mr. Gething, the Welsh Minister, described it memorably yesterday as being found down the back of a DHSC sofa.
Well, it was found, serious point, it was found within the resources, the central resources of the department, because, as I said, ministers wanted to make swift progress.
And if we just look at one document, it's RLIT 301496, please. We look at the bottom half of the page. It's the last 3 lines on the page. The recently announced £30 million uplift in payments in England will be coming from existing 2019-20 Department of Health and Social Care's non-NHS budget and is not a new allocation from HM Treasury. There is therefore no Barnet consequential arising from this for the existing Northern Ireland scheme. So again, is it right to understand that because the funding came from within the existing budget rather than being a separate allocation from Treasury, the way in which funding to the devolved administrations works meant that they did not receive any equivalent funding from the Treasury, a Barnet consequential?
That's correct.
And what, if any, consideration was given to by you or your colleagues or the junior minister, to your knowledge, to the impact on the devolved administrations, particularly Wales and Northern Ireland, for whose beneficiaries this would serve to increase the disparity considerably?
Well, I think we recognised that we wanted to make progress at that time, and it was also starting to be a part of the policy discussion about moving towards greater parity, and Jackie Doyle-Price mentions that in her written ministerial statement. But we felt that the right thing to do was still to go ahead with the changes in England because ministers wanted to make those improvements.
Is it right that the department was very keen in terms of the timing of this announcement, for the announcement to be made because the infected blood inquiry was about to start hearing evidence from victims?
Yes, it's also true that we wanted to make the change and make it happen. I mean, regardless of the inquiry, if you know what I mean. So I think the answer to the question is both.
If I could add some context, if you follow the paperwork that has been put in front of us today, I might say that this is a quite a common consequence of devolution. That the UK minister starts out seeking a UK-wide scheme, that for whatever reason that agreement isn't possible, and as we saw in between the first document and the second document, it was clear that the Scottish Government made a decision of their own and published that decision. And that clearly left the English scheme less generous than the Scottish scheme, and we wanted to address that, and I supported Jackie Doyle-Price, although, as I said, she did the bulk of the work in making that happen. And the practicalities of devolved government are that the devolved administrations are within their rights to make decisions like that, even if they lead to more differences between the four nations. And so a series of events like this, where the UK government, which also, of course, is responsible for England, seeks a UK-wide approach, does not get that because one of the devolved administrations decides to go differently, and then acts on an England basis, happens from time to time. And on this last paragraph, when we are acting in a way that where the sum of money is such that we can find it from within the department's overall existing budget, we would normally have a discussion with the Treasury about whether this would be additional, which would then have the Barnett consequentials. And then if the Treasury disagreed with that, we would have the decision as to whether to find it from elsewhere within the departmental budget, which would mean managing other elements of the budget in a tighter way, in order to make something happen. So I hope that assists the inquiry in understanding the realities of managing services that are devolved.
If we just look at one further document on this issue, HSSG 0020025, please, Shomik. This is an undated document, but I think the date in the first line, in fact, is wrong. I think it should be October 2018. But in any event, it's on the topic of parity, and it refers to the January 2019 meeting, and then we can see in paragraph 3 it refers to the 30th of April date. We can see in paragraph 3 reference there to inequalities, parity, which I'll come on to at a later stage in more detail. It says, Cabinet Office was keen for any announcements to be made prior to the infected blood inquiry resuming their gathering of evidence from the 30th of April 2019. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, it says, we were advised that to mitigate the risk of legal challenge to the changes, we should work within the structure of the existing infected blood support scheme for England. And to make an announcement by the 30th of April, it was considered that we would not be able to address the cross-UK parity question within the time allowed. Two questions, and maybe these are for you, Mr. Vineall, given your more detailed involvement in the decision-making. What do we understand by the reference to mitigating the risk of legal challenge to the changes?
Well, the advice in the submissions that went up about this issue said that if you want to make changes to the scheme quickly and not to consult on it, we needed to work within the infrastructure that we had. So we had to work within the existing parameters. That's what that first sentence means in government speak.
And then in terms of the second sentence, Is it right to understand from this that effectively the cross-UK parity question was parked?
I was about to say the same word. Yes, I mean it was parked because we wanted to take the action.
We can take that down, thank you. Just want to ask some questions more broadly. First of you, Mr. Vineall, and then of you, Mr. Hancock, about some of the principles or philosophy that might underpin the financial support scheme. Mr. Vineall, to your knowledge, has there ever been any attempt to actually assess the needs of the infected and their families, or to assess the extent of their losses?
Well, it slightly depends what you mean by needs. We have done, on certain occasions, there have been, we have taken views about the needs of the infected and affected and reflected them in the policy. So, for example, 2016, people pointed out, it seems slightly surprising in retrospect now, 75% of people had Hep C stage 1 and there was no payment for that at the time, so we introduced it. Obviously, the special category mechanism is based on a particular kinds of needs above Hep C stage 1 lower than Hep C stage 2. The lump sum 10,000 payment was introduced at the end of 2016 because we wanted the bereaved had said they wanted a variety of ways of being supported. Obviously, the discretionary payments review in 2018, which was led by the BSA on our behalf, partly included consultation, a small c consultation with the infected and the affected. And obviously, more recently, we've moved to the position of parity because obviously we had pretty strong representations about that. So I think we do respond to need. If you're saying to me, during my time for the responsibility in this job, have we done a sort of full-scale clinical needs assessment? We haven't done that.
Or any kind of assessment of the kind and range of losses that people infected and affected have experienced?
Could you clarify what you mean by losses? I think I know what you mean, but I can give an accurate answer.
People have been unable to work. People have had to give up their jobs.
Yeah.
People
okay.
have carers have had to give up their jobs to care. So the financial losses over decades sustained by those infected may be huge. That's never, I think, been assessed by the department so far.
Yes. I think the scheme in its construction is aiming to meet people's needs in lots of different ways to try and address that issue.
What's the basis, again this is for you Mr Vineall, for the quantification of the EBS payments? So I'm not going to ask you about individual payments and their precise sum, but what are they pegged to? Or is it very much more a question of, well, we've inherited them from the Alliance House organisations, we've upped it a bit, this is what we can afford to give?
It's a mixture of all those things, I think. I mean, they're often pegged to consumer price index. They are, I mean, as I said at the start, in part inherited from the Alliance House organisations. Partly, like anything, there is at the end of the day a cost envelope around these things. And in addition, obviously more recently, we've been, moved to try and bring parity with the other schemes. So all of those things have driven decisions at various times about the levels of support provided.
I think amongst the many documents we sent you, and indeed that you exhibited, we didn't, I think, include a report from the All-Party Parliamentary Group from 2015. But if you'll take it from me, that one of the observations that group made was that successive governments had not carried out a holistic independent assessment of the support necessary to meet the full needs of all beneficiaries, and instead support had expanded haphazardly. Would you accept that as a general observation?
I'd accept it with the exception of the word haphazard, because I think it was more sophisticated than that, as I've described.
Do you agree, Mr Hancock, that it might now be important to undertake a comprehensive, holistic, systematic assessment of the losses that people have suffered and of their needs?
Well, I think it is very important that we have a proper process around coming to a fair and just way of ensuring that people are supported. We've set up the review under Sir Robert Francis, a man of great integrity and capability, to look into ways in which this may be done. And so rather than giving a specific answer, I think that it's better, our judgment was that it was better to set up a process around which a decision over questions around like this could be properly concluded, and for that to report before the inquiry reports, so that for two reasons. Firstly, so its conclusions could be taken into account by the inquiry, but secondly, so that we can be ready for any conclusions that the inquiry might come to.
Well, I'll come back at a later stage, if I may, to a handful more questions about the Sir Robert Francis's review and what's proposed. Do you accept, Mr. Hancock, that the current scheme, with or without the parity payments announced in March of 2021, does not purport to compensate for the range of past losses that people may have experienced?
The current scheme is not a support. It is not a compensation scheme. It is a support scheme. It was set up like that, and I know that that's one of the questions that the inquiry will no doubt address.
Do you consider, and this is a question directed to you, Mr. Hancock, that there is a moral responsibility on government to address the impacts of what's happened to those infected and affected?
Yes, I do.
Just move next then just to some questions to help us understand the funding position and the budget position in relation to the funding of both EBS and then the funding that's contributed to the devolved schemes. So, Mr. Vineall, first of all, as this sits within your directorate, where does the funding for EBS come from? We leave aside for a moment in March 2021.
Yeah.
Where and how has EBS been funded in the year since 2017?
Well, it comes from my division, and it comes quarterly, and it's a distinct budget called EBS budget, which is, this is the important point, which is separate from the NHS mandate budget. So it is a budget that is separate from other mainstream NHS England expenditure. And then the administration costs of EBS since 1920 are within the overall grant in aid administration budget that goes to the NHS BSA as a job lot. That doesn't sit in my division, that comes from a central finance function. So there's two mechanisms into EBS financially.
Now, funding that the Department of Health and Social Care provides to the other devolved schemes, so the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish scheme, we've heard evidence this week that funding in relation to HIV payments comes from the Department of Health and Social Care. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And why is that?
Well, as I said in my second statement, when the Alliance House organisations were coming to an end and the new 4-country schemes were being set up, the resources proportionate to the new schemes in the devolved administrations were transferred, and the HIV component wasn't. And as I say in my second statement, that was basically a mistake at the Spending Review 2015, and I did try and find out the background to the mistake for coming here, and I couldn't. So effectively, the HIV budget has stayed in the Department of Health.
And if we look at, just by way of example, WITN 46888034, please show me. So this is an email 9th December 2020. This one happens to be in relation to HIV payments for the Welsh scheme. We have similar documents in relation to Scotland and Northern Ireland. This says that the payment amount has been calculated as follows. Non-discretionary amount calculated by multiplying number of beneficiaries by annual payment amount. Now, is it correct to understand that the reference there to annual payment amount is to the English annual payment amount?
Yeah, that's right. So what that's saying is you take the annual payment amount in England, you multiply it by the number of people who need that support in the devolved administration, and then we send it as a straight flat cash transfer to the devolved administration.
And so if under the Northern Irish, Welsh or Scottish schemes, they wish to make payments that in respect of HIV that are higher than the English payment, they have to find the funding for that themselves.
That's correct.
And then in terms of the discretionary amount, calculated by applying the Barnett formula to EBE's actual HIV discretionary spend in October 19 to September 2020. So is it right to understand that the amount that's given to the devolved schemes in terms of funding for them to give discretionary one-off grants and so on in respect of those suffering from HIV is effectively pegged to what EBES has spent during the earlier
it's
period?
proportionate to the EBES pool, and then it's multiplied by the Barnett formula. So the 380,000 to D would have been the discretionary spend for people with HIV during that year, and then the Barnett consequential is attached, and that gives you the total amount that's transferred.
We can take that down. Thank you, Shamik. We've heard or seen in written form some evidence in the course of the week to suggest that the lack of a longer-term commitment in relation to HIV funding has been problematic for the devolved administrations, because it doesn't know how much it's going to get, and it doesn't know how long it's going to get it for. What's your observation, if any, on that?
Well, we don't have any plans to change the current set of arrangements, but we are going to look into it as part of the next spending round.
Because as I understand what you've said in your statement and your reference to there being a payment miscalculation, the reason why the current scheme operates is because of that payment miscalculation, and the current system effectively reflects the spending review period from 2015 or 2016.
Yes, I mean, it's really just done on an annual basis, because, I mean, actually there have been more spending reviews than were predicted in 2015-16 because we had different changes of government.
If I may say, it's absolutely normal in government to fund something for 1 year when there's a 1 year spending review, and the devolved administrations would, as we do, deliver their funding on that basis, and there is absolutely no expectation that these funds would reduce, and so whilst everybody would love in life to have longer certainty, that isn't a normal reality, because budgets are only set for a certain period in front of you. But for something like this, where it's absolutely clear that commitments are going to be honoured for as long as they're needed, and that, of course, must be the case as well in the future, there's I don't think it's reasonable to say that having a 1 year settlement time would make any difference, because there'd be no expectation that sum of money would decline.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say exactly the same. The expectation that we wouldn't continue to transfer this money if that's a set of arrangements we continue with, I mean, we would.
Yes, I think we've heard some evidence to suggest that there may have been reductions in the amount received the previous year, for example, because of the way in which it's calculated, so the discretionary spend being pegged to what IBS had spent. Applying the Barnett consequential formula had led to one of the schemes, I can't remember off the top of my head which one, thank you, receiving less than it previously had.
Yes, that is true. That is the way the system works. I mean, it's also true that if we put up the rates in England for the flat rate HIV payment, then more will
Yes.
go out to the devolved administrations. So these things work both ways.
Now, Mr. Hancock's answer a moment ago touched on the next issue I wanted to explore with you, which is looking at the longer term from the perspective of those infected and affected. We looked a little while ago at a document which talked in terms about these being, and I'm looking at the current scheme, leave aside for a moment the work that may be undertaken by Sir Robert Francis. Ex gratia, that's common to, I think, to the other schemes as well. It's always been expressed as ex gratia, and that's defined in terms in IBS materials as being something the government does voluntarily. And of course, that which the government does voluntarily can be taken away. Does the department understand, indeed Mr. Hancock, do you understand and appreciate the uncertainty and insecurity experienced by those who depend upon such money, and the absence of a long-term assurance or commitment may significantly increase their suffering and distress and anxiety?
Well, as I said in my earlier answer, that is not how I think the situation should be interpreted, and I'm very happy to give a commitment that as long as I have anything to do with it, it won't be. And those commitments are made by government to those affected for as long as they're needed. I acknowledge that may not be how it's interpreted, and I would look to the inquiry to assess whether that's a reasonable position to hold.
I think we had some evidence to suggest that the Scottish government had felt able to give an assurance to its infected and affected community that there was an expectation of payments for the lifetime of the recipient.
Yes.
Is that your expectation, Mr. Hancock?
Yes, I would absolutely give a commitment to anybody receiving a payment, any of the beneficiaries infected or affected, that I would expect that to continue for their lifetime. Absolutely. That's my expectation. I would say it goes without saying, but sometimes these things need to be said.
Now, governments change, obviously, and you may not be able to bind future governments, but has there been, given that this does not appear to be a particularly party political issue, have there been discussions across the parties about a unified approach in terms of the longevity of a financial support scheme?
Not that I've been involved in.
Is that something which might be a good idea?
Well, I certainly think that it's reasonable. However, that isn't normally how a scheme like this would be made permanent, because one Parliament can't bind a future one. The best way to make it permanent is for the Secretary of State responsible to declare that it should be and will be permanent, and I'm very happy to do that.
And has consideration been given, to your knowledge, to embedding a scheme in primary legislation? Scotland has some primary legislation, albeit that much of the detail is then worked out through executive decision making.
No consideration I know of has been given to that, partly because I think that it is absolutely everybody's expectation within government that support should continue for as long as it's needed, and I don't think anybody who would anybody in government or who might expect to be in government would demur from that.
Then on a separate issue, a point of detail which arises from Mr. Brown's evidence this morning, and this is a question directed to you, I think, in the first instance, Mr. Vineall. Mm-hmm. And it's just about the appeal system that EBS operates. So the Scottish scheme appeal process allows for attendance in person of the applicant who's making an appeal against a decision that they're not eligible, whereas, and I think they can attend with a representative. We heard from Mr. Brown that the English scheme does not permit that, and I paraphrase his evidence, but effectively he said that reflected the policy of the Department of Health, and if the Department of Health wanted to change it, they could, and EBS could then implement that. Do you have anything you can help us understand why the department's policy has been no in-person appeals, and whether that could now change?
Well, it's always been the arrangement we've had. We thought it was, in many ways, more straightforward, and there's the practicalities of travel. But clearly that's something that we're happy to listen to what the inquiry might have to say on that issue.
I want to turn next to the question of psychological support.
Yeah.
We know that Wales has a, if I can use the term, bespoke psychological support service. So it's a service expressly set up to cater for the needs of those who were infected and their families. So too does Northern Ireland. Scotland's support service was bespoke in the sense of provided to those with bleeding disorders, and is now, we heard from the Minister at the beginning of the week, being extended to those who were infected through transfusion. England doesn't have a bespoke psychological support service. So I'm going to look with you both at some recent, or some documents from over the past year or so in relation to that. But in broad terms, and asking you first of all, Mr. Vineall, why does England not have a bespoke psychological support service for those who've been so grievously injured?
I suppose because we'd never fully considered putting one in place beforehand. But obviously we recognised the need for that last year when we made it simpler to access counselling services without having to be on a waiting list or a GP, partly recognising impact of the pandemic. And, you know, having made that change, the numbers, you know, doubled in the 9 months of 2020 compared with what had gone on in the previous years. And probably the things you'll exhibit are the submissions and the discussion and the commentary this year. What I can say is we've now picked that work back up in earnest, and we held a meeting last week with EBS and NHS England where the gist of the discussion was that we wanted to move to a bespoke service that effectively had, I mean, in simple terms, a clinician embedded within EBS who could act as a signposting pathway for people who need psychological support with expert input, not just counselling services, but IAP services, access to psychological therapies, and indeed other services. And EBS on that basis have gone away to write a first service specification with, you know, assisted clinical input from NHS England. And we would like to get to a position, I can't put a timescale on it yet, where we did have some hub service within EBS that was able to, you know, reliably give clinical advice to help people access these kinds of services. I think the one thing that makes it slightly more difficult, not hugely more difficult, is because England's a bigger country than the other countries. The critical thing that was stressed at the meeting is if you're going to refer people into a service, the people inside the service need to be cognizant and understand what the particular needs of the infected and the affected are. So we need to make sure we had a proper sort of structure in place for that, so that when people reach the service, I mean, going on what we said earlier, they're treated appropriately with an understanding of what the particular needs are. So yes, we don't have a service, but yes, we want to get a service.
Can we then just look at a handful of the documents to see whether you can assist us in understanding why it's taken this period of time? So if we go first of all to EIBS 40696. So these are a series of emails, and if we go, please, Seamus, to the third email. Sorry, third page, my apologies. And bottom half of the page, so the date of this is February 2020, and we can see under the heading Commission Bespoke Offer of Psychological Support for Individuals Affected and Infected by the Infected Blood Tragedy. During Claire's meeting with PSPSM on 5th of February, NHS England agreed to work up options to deliver a bespoke offer of psychological support for those infected by the infected blood tragedy. A holding line to this effect has gone out in correspondence from the Cabinet Office ministers. The Minister is keen to demonstrate progress on this issue and would like to press ahead and consider specific proposals to deliver a bespoke offer of support. Now, just so that we can understand the reference to that, that's a reference, I think, to Ms Claire Foreman from NHS England, who's provided a statement to the inquiry, at meeting with the Minister. So that would have been Nadine Dorris.
Correct.
So we can see that over a year ago, February 2020, which was when the inquiry, I think if I'm right in remembering this correctly, was hearing evidence from its psychosocial expert group and asking for evidence about bespoke services. We can see there an agreement being reached and the Minister herself being said to be keen to demonstrate progress. If we then go, Shomik, please, to EIBS 4069, sorry, it's the same document, first page, my apologies. So we can see this is the 4th of March 2020. So fairly quickly, NHS England have come back with an outline of 3 proposals, or 3 options to meet the psychological needs of the affected and infected, with a third being a bespoke service. So a fairly quick response from NHS England. If we could then look at a submission to ministers that month, so EIBS 40709. If we go to the next page, we can see the date of this is the 5th of March 2020. It's advice addressed to the Minister, and we can see the issue is following recent meetings regarding the infected blood inquiry. You commissioned NHS England to investigate options for providing psychological support for those affected. And the recommendation is that the Minister ask NHS England to work with Department of Health officials to develop proposals for proportionate psychological support services for people with infected blood. And reference there to option 3, and if we go to the next page, we can see there 3 options. Option 1 is improved access to existing NHS services through EBS. Option 2 is expansion of existing services, and option 3 is bespoke NHS psychological support services for people with infected blood. And if we look at the very bottom of the page, the recommendation we see there in paragraph 9 is option 3, with a comment, this is the only one of the 3 options that is likely to meet the demands of those involved in the inquiry. So we've got to the 5th of March of last year. That's the recommendation. If we could then go, please, Shomik, to EIBS 40697. We look at the decision and then I can ask a question. So this is an email, if we ignore the date at the top of the page, because I think that's subsequently forwarding the email on to others, including you, Mr. Vineall. And we can see it's 17th of March 2020. Many thanks for this. PSM, so the Minister's reviewed and would like to progress option 3, noting, however, that we should be trying to do this within existing funding for services if possible. So March of last year, that was the decision, as I understand these documents, that was taken by the Minister. We're over a year later, and there doesn't, if you'll forgive me for putting it this way, seem to have been much by way of progress. Why is that?
Well, there wasn't as much progress as we'd hoped, and it was realistically one of those things that when COVID started to impact on us, we weren't able to take forward.
You've referred, I think, to there was a change in May of 2020,
Yeah,
which was...
Yes. That was a kind of almost a subset of option 1, because if you look back to option 1, it mentions IAPT. Well, we didn't do IAPT, but we made it easier for people to use the counselling services. Part of the reason why we did that quickly was because COVID was impacting this time last year, so we wanted to make the changes that we could quickly.
So you're able to tell us now, are you, referring to your evidence a few minutes ago, that as of the meeting that you've described last week, work is now underway in relation to implementing option 3?
That's correct. We obviously need to take the details back to ministers because the meeting was only last week, but the action from the meeting was for EBS to go away and work up a first draft service specification.
Is that likely to require additional funding?
Well, for them to do that work doesn't require additional funding, but clearly the service in one way, shape or form will require some funding, and that's one of the things we want to work up sharpish.
Mr. Hancock, are you able to give us any kind of assurance or commitment that the funding that's required subject obviously to it not being outrageous or unreasonable, will be made available to allow that bespoke psychological service to be implemented.
Yes, and this amount of funding that could possibly reasonably be needed is small in the overall scheme of mental health services that we provide. I'd also stress on this email that really the key words here are with everything else going on, because just after the 17th of March last year, we did move a significant number of civil servants onto absolutely critical COVID-related duties. And over the last 2 months, we've been able to move people back onto other very important topics like this.
Thank you. Now, we can take that down, Shamik. I want to ask you next about some things that are not within EABS, and to explore with both of you the position in relation to that. First of all, as we've seen, the EABS scheme, in common with the schemes in the other devolved administrations, I should say, covers those infected with HIV, covers those infected with hepatitis C, does not make any provision for those infected with hepatitis B. First of all, to you, Mr. Vineall, have you seen any evidence in the documents that you've looked at within the department or in the discussions that you've had within the department that the department expressly considered the inclusion of hepatitis B into the EABS scheme when the change was being made in 2016-17?
No,
So you've not seen anything that suggests express consideration?
that's right.
What is the position today in that respect?
Well, the position is that we think the testing regime that was established, I think, in about 1972 for hepatitis B was sufficient to ensure that people with hepatitis B wouldn't be, subject to the risk with infected blood, and that's why it's never been part of any scheme.
The inquiry has certainly received, read, heard evidence from those who were infected with hepatitis B after the introduction of the measures you described in the early 1970s. Is it the department's position that can't have happened?
Well, I don't think it can be our position that it can't have happened if some people have said it happened.
Because you'll appreciate, Mr. Vineall and Mr. Hancock, the view from the perspective of someone who is infected with hepatitis B, which in itself is also a very serious illness, in consequence of infected blood or blood products, it seems to them somewhat anomalous, given that the current scheme is not based upon any kind of admission of liability or fault on the part of the government, that they're excluded from it, whereas if they had hepatitis C, they would be included within it. Do you accept that there's a...
Well, I can only repeat what I said before, which is because there was an effective testing regime, it's never been felt necessary to include it as part of the scheme.
Is that something which the department is willing to look at further, given that there is a lot of further work that it's undertaking in relation to plans for financial support, or has
we don't have any current plans to consider it.
Mr. Hancock, have you had drawn to your attention any of the evidence or examples or description of the circumstances of those who were infected with hepatitis B?
I have at a broad level, and what I would say is there is the distinction of whether an effective test was available, because effective tests are now available to test blood for other diseases, and there is a regime of within all medicine for when things go wrong, where there is an agreed process. But I also understand, of course, what this situation looks and feels like from the point of somebody infected with infected blood or affected by that with hepatitis B. as distinct from hepatitis C or indeed HIV?
The second area I wanted to ask about, again, and this is in terms of exclusions from the scheme, relates to individuals who may have been infected with blood or blood products, so infected with hepatitis C or HIV, after the September 1991 cut-off date. And they too are, as things stand in the current scheme, excluded from EAPS. And again, the position is similar in the devolved administration schemes. The inquiry has received evidence, which no doubt, Mr. Vineall, you're aware of individuals in respect of whom there is evidence of infection with hepatitis C, at least after that date. Is there any plan to review this cut-off date and extend the scheme to allow those who can demonstrate that their infection was from blood or blood products after September 1991 to receive support?
No, there isn't any plan to do that.
And why is that?
Because we think the cut-off dates are accurate and sensible.
Accurate in what sense?
Accurate in terms of the fact that there was an effective test available after September 1991.
The third area I wanted to explore is the scope of payments to the bereaved. So the scheme set up by the department, as set out in the service specification that the department produces, makes provision for partners, spouses who are bereaved to receive lump sum payment, and now most recently the regular payments as well. But family members beyond that are excluded from the scheme. What is the justification, Mr. Hancock, for excluding wider family members such as parents whose children died as a result of infection, or adult children whose parents died, from the scheme?
Well, because the scheme, this is a question of how the scheme was set up as an ex gratia scheme for support of those infected and affected, and as a support scheme, it was therefore set up in this way.
A parent whose child was infected and died may have sustained financial losses in the same way as a spouse or partner, may have given up work to care for their child, may have been so grievously affected by the death of their child that impacted upon their ability to work. And obviously their grief and loss is no less. It's one of the greatest tragedies perhaps that someone can experience. Likewise, a child whose parent died from HIV. Where's the moral justification for the exclusion? I understand your answer that those were the Alliance House organisation systems, and that's how EAPS has emerged from it. But where's the moral justification for that difference?
Well, the justification that was given was that this is a support scheme for redress of financial hardship as a consequence of this tragedy, as opposed to a compensation scheme to compensate those who have suffered a wider injustice and loss.
Yes, I understand the difference that you articulate there, Mr. Hancock, but the range of individuals that we're describing could themselves have financial needs as a result of the consequences of the infection or death of a loved one, could they not?
Yes, they could, and there's a number of different areas with respect to healthcare where that is taken into account. Yes.
The evidence we heard yesterday, I think it's yesterday, from Mr. Gething, or from one of the ministers this week, seemed to be some thinking that this was an issue that was going to be looked at, the widening of the scope of the scheme to wider family members, rather than the payments being limited to spouses, partners and the like, in ongoing discussions. Is that right? Is that something that's being actively considered by the department?
Do you want me to come in on that? I mean, I wasn't aware of any of those discussions going on, I have to say. It's not something that's live in our mind at the moment.
Is that something the department is willing to look at again, Mr. Hancock?
Well, we are willing to look at all considerations put forward by the inquiry. And we've set up the Robert Francis review to look into how that could come about. But in a way, the question that you're getting at is about the question of whether the scheme should be about compensation or about support. So I think it's worth cutting to the chase rather than dancing around that. The honest truth is this was set up as a support scheme, as ex gratia scheme, as we've discussed. But I have no doubt that this is something that the inquiry will look at, and I would expect it to. And I respect the process of the inquiry, and I will respect its recommendations. And should the inquiry's recommendations point to compensation, then of course we will pay compensation. And so Robert Francis's review on compensation is there in order that the government will be able to respond quickly to that. But it would be wrong to preempt the findings of the inquiry on that basis by me giving a policy recommendation in the middle of it. And so I think it's best, no matter where I would like this to go, what I would like to happen is I would like the inquiry to explore all of these questions. But what I can say to you is that we will respect the outcome of the inquiry, and if the inquiry points to compensation as opposed to a support scheme in the future, then the government will pay compensation.
I wonder if I may just to tell you something which is puzzling me a little. It's understanding quite where the boundaries between a support scheme and other schemes fall. The reason for asking you that is I suspect neither of you have been made aware that when the Macfarlane Trust was first set up, and obviously that was as a support scheme back in 1987, set up in 88, Clause 4, which is in front of me now as I look at this, said that the objects were to establish or to relieve people who were suffering from infection. Then it went on to say, or the needy spouses, parents, children and other dependents of such persons, and the needy spouses, parents, children or other dependents of such persons who have died. So that was a support scheme which did, in its conception, include the parents who had lost children. And so that's why I ask about, are the boundaries between support scheme and other schemes quite so clear?
Well, I wasn't aware of that piece of information. I have to say, I probably should have been, but I wasn't.
Well,
yeah. And I think the only thing I can say, reiterate what the Secretary of State has said on the generality of the issue, is that we've always run EBS and its predecessors as ex gratia schemes,
yes.
not as anything else.
I fully accept that. That's what's been said on a number of occasions. It's just this is the way that ex gratia scheme was set up. That was all.
Just going to press you a little more on this, if I may. We leave aside a question of what might ordinarily be understood as compensation, and just look at the question of support and what you say is the raison d'etre, the rationale of the current scheme, which is to provide a degree of ongoing financial support to those who've suffered. Payments are made by way of bereavement payment, the lump sum payment. There will now be the regular payments, without there being, as I understand it, a requirement. So it's made to the bereaved spouse or partner, without there being a requirement to show a particular need for support. A parent who has lost a child may, and I'm going to just give a hypothetical example, but it resonates with much of the evidence the inquiry's heard, be so scarred by that they are unable to work or unable to work in the way in which they would have done, and they may have as great a need for support or a greater need for support than someone else. Why is the scheme why is the scheme understood as it currently is as a support scheme and not a compensation scheme, nonetheless drawn so narrowly that only certain categories of relative can receive support?
Well, the only thing I can say is that they are the boundaries we've always drawn around the scheme.
That's a statement of status quo rather than a reason, is it not, Mr. Vineall?
Yes, I suppose the reason is that we feel that that is the appropriate groups of people to support within the current scheme.
And can I ask you to look at what's reported as being a view of the junior minister, Ms Doris, EIBS 5047, please, Shomik. So you'll see this is a meeting of the EBS Accountability Review meeting, 22nd of October 2019. We go to the next page. If we look at the top of the page, there's reference there to discussions about parity, which I may come back to.
Yeah.
And then you'll see, I hope, the sentence just below the 3 bullet points or sub-paragraphs, which says this: Nadine, that's Nadine Dorries as I take it, expressed that she wanted to take steps to increase parity across the 4 Nations schemes, including other affected family members such as parents. So that appears to be the minister, junior minister, with the overall day-to-day ministerial responsibility for this, expressing the view that other affected family members should be brought within the existing support scheme. Are you able, Mr. Hancock, to cast any further light on that?
No, it's not something I've ever discussed with Nadine Dorries, but as I was saying earlier, typically on a judgment like this, you always have to have a boundary of any support scheme. As a minister, you have to take into account taxpayers who pay for these things, and on a question of the precise design of a support scheme, I would delegate that to my minister.
Well, perhaps we'll be able to ask Ms Doris to explain what her views were at that time. We can take that down, Shomik. I'm going to move then to the issue of parity and look at what's happened leading up to the March announcement and then to the March announcement. First of all, Mr. Hancock, as a matter of generality, common sense, do you accept that it was at least a very likely consequence of having 4 devolved schemes that there would be disparity?
Not necessarily. After all, this tragedy happened when there wasn't devolution of health, and it affected people right across the UK, and there's a logic to therefore saying that the support available to people across the UK should be the same. It's an absolutely reasonable logic. It is an inevitability of devolution that ministers can take decisions differently in the 4 nations, and as I said, the movement in the policy papers from early 2016 to mid 2016 happens, and it's usually to the frustration of the UK minister. If we were to have a UK scheme to support everybody in the same way across the UK as they themselves were affected to their very significant detriment across the UK, I would be delighted by that. But as the minister responsible only for the provision of the scheme in England, I can't automatically make it happen.
Were there measures that were put in place, and maybe this may be a question for you, Mr. Vineall, were there measures that were put in place, as far as you know, at the outset of the 4 schemes going their 4 separate ways, to try and minimise the extent of disparity? And if so, what were those measures?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, normal devolution practices, you establish things, and the point of devolution is to allow those devolved administrations to make decisions.
We looked at some evidence yesterday, which you may or may not have been aware of. If you heard Mr. Gething's evidence, you would have heard it.
I did.
From the clinical psychologist who is attached to the WIB scheme. Very powerful evidence from Dr. Coffey about the psychological harm of people being treated differently, of the psychological consequences of disparity. Now, I appreciate that's not material that you wouldn't necessarily have seen before yesterday, but in principle, do you accept, does the department accept that disparity in the context with which we are concerned could be harmful for the infected and affected communities?
I'm not sure I would accept that, because I think we introduced the 4 schemes through devolution to allow difference to happen. I do recognise that when you get difference and people start to make comparisons, then it's then those comparisons become difficult.
Can we look at a document that's I think forms an annex to your statement, Mr. Hancock? Seamus, it's WITN 5704001. And can we go to page 5, please? Annex A, so this was an annex to your statement, Mr. Hancock, summary of work on parity since July 2018. And you pick it up in paragraph 1 with referring to a letter from the inquiry chair to David Liddington, the then Cabinet Office Minister, raising concerns about disparity that had been flagged up during the inquiry's preliminary hearings in the autumn of 2018. Is it right to understand that prior to this point in time, the department had not itself taken any particular steps to understand the disparities and address them?
I'm afraid I'm not aware. I had that's a question that's best addressed to Jackie Doyle-Price, who was the minister at the time.
Well, we know, not least from, if we go to the second paragraph, you mention it, here, a meeting in January 2019 took place. We can see Ms. Doyle-Price is recorded by you as having said during this meeting, this is the last sentence, coming together on devolved matters could be difficult and take time.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, if you think of the context of this meeting took place a couple of years after the Scottish administration had decided to take a decision which increased disparity, and working between the 4 devolved nations could be difficult and take time. That is an accurate description of trying to bring parity in areas that are devolved. I'd say actually that over the last year or so, that has those challenges have reduced significantly, because we've all been having to work incredibly closely together on COVID, and we were able therefore to get to the statement which I very warmly welcomed earlier this year, that we will seek parity and not make further changes without consultation between us that increase disparities. And in fact, it's at the end of the next paragraph, that the goal there was to reduce at least some of the gaps between the English and in particular the Scottish scheme. And I'm glad that we've been able to do that since.
I understand in government decision-making terms, a period of time from the autumn of 2018 to March of 2021 to bring about these changes, this coming closer together, reducing disparity, may in government terms not seem like a terribly long period of time, and understand also, of course, that COVID has intervened. From the perspective of those infected and affected, it does seem quite a long time
Yeah.
to achieve what was achieved in March of this year.
Well-
Why has it taken that long?
Well, unfortunately, Jackie Doyle-Price was right. She explained that coming together on devolved matters could be difficult and take time. The position of the UK government has been in favour of moving towards parity throughout this. Indeed, as this whole session demonstrates, we started out seeking a UK-wide scheme and weren't able to achieve that. So I absolutely appreciate that 2.5 years is a long time if you're looking for parity, and I'm very glad we've been able to make progress. Part of the that time period was undoubtedly because of the pandemic, the decisions to move people onto COVID-related matters was a difficult but absolutely necessary in the circumstances. I wish it were easier, and I hope it will be more so in the future.
What, if any, steps were taken by the UK government between the issue being raised by the inquiry chair in October 2018 and March of 2020, so in the period prior to the pandemic? What actual steps did the department take to try and bring together the four nations and work on resolving disparities across the whole of the UK?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah.
Can you just repeat your timescale? Is it January 19 to March?
Well, from October 2018,
18.
picking it up on the date where
Yeah,
Mr.
yeah.
Hancock's note picks it up from,
Yeah.
to March 2020, what was actually done?
Well, there were a couple of things. So I can't really speak for 2018, but I don't think anything significant happened in the last couple of months of 2018. In 2019, we had the meeting in January, as we've discussed earlier, that led to the April changes. At that time, parity, in a sense, was a growing policy concern, and I suppose the upshot of the April 2019 events was it brought into stark focus the fact that on the one hand, you can be doing a lot to improve the system in one country, and on the other hand, you inadvertently generate a disparity by wishing to make your improvements. And in a sense, the discussion between April and July, which was when the Prime Minister wrote to the Haemophilia Society, which was effectively the formal announcement of parity as a policy, worked that through. And the document from earlier that we didn't have a take for, but was sometime in 2019, sort of June-ish, was that debate coming out. And I think if you look at that and all of the other documents, you can see that Jackie was acknowledging this dichotomy, and indeed, she was the first person, I think, publicly in a written ministerial statement to say, I would like to reach out and see if we can get to parity. So she said that in the same breath as doing something that meant there were therefore more differences. So we got to July 2019 and we got the agreement. We were in the process of trying in the latter part of 2019, before the general election that was called at the end of October, to get to a position, and it's in one of the parliamentary questions that you exhibit, where we say words to the effect that there is a pressing need to try and move to a situation of greater parity between Wales, Northern Ireland and England. And in a sense, that was the upshot of the discussions I've just described. That didn't happen because the election intervened. We then moved to, we came out of the election, government came out of the, return came out of the election. We then had the January 2020 meeting that you know about, that Nadine was at and I was at, and parity was again mentioned there. And we started to sort of, crank up for work on parity. In the meantime, Northern Ireland, as Robin Swan was saying on Wednesday, took some steps to effectively catch up Northern Ireland to some of the England scheme changes. And from memory, there was a modicum of that that was done in Wales as well, which is in the, wherever it is, it's in sort of paragraph 4 or paragraph 5 of the Secretary of State's statement. So that really summarises the situation. You said to March 2020. That's basically what happened, which more or less takes you down to paragraph 6 of the Secretary of State's annex.
Just so that I can understand what the as it were, the the events were,
Yeah.
so not just parliamentary statements saying this is important, but actually events. There's the meeting in January 2019,
Correct.
which involved campaigners and ministers.
Yeah.
There's a ministerial meeting in
10th of
July of
July.
2019.
Yeah.
Where, and we looked at it again with,
Yeah.
I think with Mr. Gething yesterday, so you're
Yeah.
no doubt familiar with that, but where there was a commitment in principle, or an agreement in principle,
Yes.
but fair to say, not a great deal of consensus on what parity actually meant. Would you accept that?
Yes, if I can just comment on that, you're absolutely right, and I suppose that 10th of July meeting was what then led into the letter at the end of July from the Prime Minister that really set out parity. And I think if you look at that discussion from the 10th of July, people are saying we understand parity to mean something that gets you broadly financial equivalence across the schemes. That also may mean scheme rule changes or other aspects that give you a broader sense of parity. But at the same time, which I think is what you're alluding to, is also grounded in the fact, as we've been discussing, that there are 4 schemes, and we respect the fact that there are 4 schemes, and at the margins that they will generate things that are different. And if you take those components, that's how we got to the understanding of parity.
If we look at, I think we might have already looked at it, but I just want to look at it again, a document at EIBS 5047. So it's this October 2019 meeting again. If we can go to the second page again. I'd referred you to it for what Ms Doris had said, but if we look, it's about the 4th paragraph down. It says there are also plans for Oliver Dowden MP, Minister for the Cabinet Office, also responsible for the inquiry, to write to the lead of the Treasury requesting a £3 million uplift for Wales and £1 million for Northern Ireland. Do you know whether that was done? Was a bid put into the Treasury for additional funding for the devolved administrations?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. But I do know that what that would be referring to is effectively what I was quoting from the PQ about if we do a consultation on parity between the 3 schemes, how could money be found to support that?
Well, again, no doubt we may be able to ask others about that because the documentation, I think, that we've got at the moment doesn't give us an answer. Well, if we move on then, that's autumn 2019. We just go to the January 2020 meeting. It's at EIBS 40698. And we'll see there Infected Blood Round Table at the Cabinet Office 28th of January 2020. And it was attended by the then Minister for the Cabinet Office and by Nadine Dorris. If we go over to the second page, we can see at the top of the page, we see the Cabinet Office Minister acknowledging concerns regarding lack of progress towards achieving greater parity since January 2019. Then there's a reference to the Northern Ireland announcement. We heard about that from Robin Swan, but noted there was still work to be done regarding Wales, etc. And then paragraph 2 is his acknowledgement that there are other discrepancies that must be addressed if the government was to make good the commitment made last July to achieve greater parity. And then if we just go just below paragraph 3, please, Shomek, the next paragraph. It says the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Mental Health, so that's Nadine Dorris, said she was primarily here to listen, and just as the Minister for the Cabinet Office would report to the Prime Minister, so she would do the same to the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock. She added that finding a way forward with the devolved administrations would be key. Mr Hancock, are you able to assist us with whether Ms Dorris did report back to you following this meeting, and if so, what, if any, steps were taken?
She may well have done. I have no direct recollection of that, but I wouldn't expect to have a recollection. I typically have a fortnightly one-on-one meeting with each of my ministers, at which an issue like this would be raised. But my relationship with Nadine on this subject was that I thought she was doing a good job pushing for the right things, which is towards parity and support for the infected and affected, and that I would support her on the details according to her best judgments.
If we then just, again, dealing still with this meeting, but go to a separate document, if we go back to the annex to your statement, Mr. Hancock, WITN 57040001. And if we go to page 6, please, show me. Bottom of the page, paragraph 6. This refers to that January 2020 meeting and the acknowledgement of lack of progress. And then it says in the last sentence, actions arising from this meeting included that ministers should write to the devolved administrations requesting urgent engagement at official level on proposals to achieve greater parity. Do either of you know whether that action was taken, the writing to the devolved administrations?
I don't know whether the action was taken.
Mr. Hancock?
I don't know, but I also wouldn't know because that would have been undertaken by the minister.
Now, we then, I think, know from correspondence we've seen and the evidence we've heard this week, so we can take that down again, shall we? That in around July, August 2020, the devolved administration's respective health departments were asked to work up costings about what it would cost to build into their schemes some of the elements of the other schemes to try and move towards parity. And I'm going to ask you about a couple of letters from the Paymaster General in a moment. But again, if we can, I'm sorry, we should have the same, I shouldn't have asked you to take the document down, Shemik. If we can go back to the same document, WITN. Thank you. And if we go to, I think it's probably now page 7. No, if we go over the, yeah, so pick it up, bottom of page 7. So we can see, bottom of the page, paragraph 9 of your note, Mr. Hancock, it refers to officials from the devolved administration speaking. Department has carried out work to compare the, we go to the top of the next page, schemes and highlight differences. The Cabinet Office asked the Department and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to undertake analytical work to investigate the costs of each scheme achieving parity of support, and that's what we understand was done in around July, August of 2020. And then we see it said that analysts worked over a period of several months on the figures to model the potential costs of achieving financial parity over a 5-year period, etc. And some of the elements that would be included in that are then set out. If we look at the bottom of the page, you say this, Mr. Hancock, based on this work, the department submitted a bid to the last spending review in autumn 2020. In the last sentence, the bid involved taking the most generous aspects of support offered across the 4 nations and applying these to EBS. We go to the next page, top of the next page. The additional costs that would be incurred by corresponding changes to the other 3 schemes, if and to the extent that their provision fell below this level, were not part of the department's bid. And then you tell us in paragraph 11 that the bid was unsuccessful in the November 2020 spending review. Now, we can see from that what happened with the work that your department had undertaken, submitted to the Treasury, unsuccessful. What happened to the work that the other 3 nations had undertaken? Because the impression I think we gleaned from the evidence so far this week was that they thought their bids were being submitted to the Treasury.
Well, shall I go first? So the Treasury decided to only do a 1-year spending review because of the economic uncertainties caused by the pandemic. The bid in this regard failed, but I don't regard a failed bid to the Treasury in a spending review as the end of the matter when I want something to happen. So we rebid after the spending review, and that's what led to the announcement in March. With respect to the devolved administration's work, it's a matter for them what happened to it, but what I do know is that we managed to land an agreed settlement and announce that. So it didn't work in the spending review, so we came back and had another go, and we made progress.
And that will bring us shortly to March 2021.
Sure.
But just sticking, if I may, with the autumn of 2020,
Yes.
Mr. Vineall, do you know what, if anything, was done with the data that the other 3 schemes, or the other 3 governments' departments of health had put together?
Well, I mean, there was a submission from the Cabinet Office with the other 3 countries' details alongside our own, and that was submitted in the letters of September 2020, and that didn't get a reply.
Okay.
So there were 2 separate things going on here. There was that bid in from the Cabinet Office, as I've just described, And we, in addition, in England, because we wanted to see if we could get the money, submitted the England component of that bid into the spending review, as the Secretary of State's just described.
And so if we want to understand why it didn't get a reply, then we should direct those questions to Her Majesty's Treasury.
Yes, or the Cabinet Office, one or the other.
And then can we just look at the two letters from the Paymaster General from 2020? So the first is at EIBS 40706. I don't think I need to ask you very much about the detail of this. You've no doubt seen the letter, 13th of July, from Penny Mordaunt to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. If we go to the second page, we can see she says in the second paragraph, she refers to the costings by the Departments of Health across the 4 nations. The resolution of these disparities is one of the main requests of the victims and their families, and my strong belief is that it would be the right thing to do. Mr. Hancock, is that a belief that you share, that that was the right thing to do?
Yes.
And then you'll see she refers then under the heading compensation for victims to her views in relation to compensation. I'll come back to that in a few moments. If we then go to her second letter to the Chancellor, EIBS 40705, we can see she wrote again on the 21st of September 2020 to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, writing to update on the infected blood inquiry. She refers under the heading financial support to the costings from the 4 nations. And then she moves to the question of compensation for victims, says it's inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. And then over the page, last paragraph, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. She refers to copying the letter to the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury and to your department, Mr. Hancock. And then I think the handwritten notice, we've ideas about a solution to this and have been trying for some time to secure a meeting with you. Do you know, Mr. Hancock, whether the Paymaster General was able to secure a meeting with the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
No, but again, I wouldn't expect to, because as you can see, this was copied to the minister responsible.
Do you agree with the view expressed by the Paymaster General that action on financial support and compensation was long overdue?
I think that resolving this problem, this whole tragedy and all that is left behind, is long overdue, yes.
And resolving this tragedy includes taking action on financial support?
Well, I'm very glad that since this letter was sent, we have been able to take action to resolve matters in terms of financial support with respect to parity, and that's and I'm really pleased that we've been able to do that. And then when it comes to the wider question and compensation, as we've discussed, I think the appropriate thing to do is to respect the results of the inquiry, and we've set up the Sir Robert Francis report as we discussed earlier.
And Mr. Hancock, have you ever had a discussion or meeting yourself with the Chancellor or with other ministers within the Treasury about funding for infected blood victims?
No, not that I can recall.
And do you know whether any of your ministers have?
I wouldn't be surprised at all to find if that Nadine Dorries had, but I don't know.
Can we then turn to the March 2021 announcement? It's at RLIT 301498, please show me. Now, we can see the date of it, 25th of March 2021, but before we look at a handful of points of detail in the announcement, the evidence we've heard this week from other ministers has suggested that the decision-making in relation to this happened very quickly in March 2021 after a fairly prolonged period of time where there had been little or nothing happening. Is that correct, Mr. Hancock?
That's my understanding. I was involved and saw this this statement before it was published. I was involved, as I said right at the start, because it came to the question of how the funding would be provided, and that was, and I was supporting Minister Dorries in getting this over the line. It is typical in government decisions that after work's been done over a period of time, and I wouldn't characterise that as delay because sometimes detailed work requires time, it is then typical that as that decision is being landed shortly before publication, it is scrutinised firstly with external bodies or arm's length bodies like EBS, and also by senior ministers. And sometimes what happens is that a decision gets strengthened, which, when you then, in retrospect, look at the timings, it looks like things had happened slowly and then suddenly accelerated. That is absolutely classic for government decision making, but there's a reason for it, and that's that the preparatory work was done, options brought forward, and then once the senior ministers got involved and once we consulted with EBS, they came forward with a stronger proposition which ministers supported, and that's what happened in this case.
And what was it that led to this happening in March as opposed to any other period of time?
That's
Well,
definitely for William.
Yeah, well, I mean, as the Secretary of State said, I suppose there was a lull between not getting money out of the spending review in November and then picking up when the letter came in from the Paymaster General. The letter was a pretty strong letter. Ministers made clear that they wanted something to happen and they wanted it to happen quickly, and in a sense that's my job. And seniors, Permanent Secretary and others in the department also said we really need to get this thing done. And we were aware that we didn't have too much time because, and this was fortuitous actually as it turned out, because hard deadlines make for decisions in government very often, that we couldn't do anything after the 26th of March, one because Parliament was in recess and the devolved administrations were going into pre-election period before the elections. So effectively what we did was we redid the figures from the we didn't redo the figures from the exercise in November. We redid the figures with the starting point being the exercise in November. The slight difference, I mean, this is technical, but it's important, is that the devolved administrations and ourselves had generated our own figures in November and then put it into Cabinet Office as the convener. And on this occasion, people in my team sort of held the calculator and the spreadsheet and said to the DAs, send in your figures and we will make sure that they are strictly calculated on a consistent basis across the 4 countries, because otherwise that wouldn't have made for, the strength of the product to get, the financial support that the Secretary of State's just described. So effectively from, I think the first meeting we had with ministers was the week after the half-term recess, about the 23rd, 24th of February. We worked from there for the month to the 26th of March, working closely with the devolved administrations and obviously through colleagues in the devolved administrations, ministers, to get to the package that was announced on the 26th of March. So we knew we had a 5 or 6 week timetable.
And where is this money coming from? Is this a bid that has been made to the Treasury? So it's extra money?
Well, this is where the timing comes into account again. So the other period the other reason for the timings here is that, of course, there was the second wave of coronavirus in between the spending review and March. So it was all hands to the pump on that. The financial year end played a part here as well, because the increased and more generous proposal, which eventually was what we put in place, was a proposal for larger lump sum funding. Because of other movements elsewhere in the departmental budget, there was within year money available to do that. So we had the burning platform of the need to make a decision before the Welsh and Scottish election purdah period started. And we had the fact that if we made the decision before the financial year end, then there was underspend elsewhere in the department, out of which the one-off payments could be funded. So the combination of the availability of a budget elsewhere in the department, plus the urgency of a deadline on policy making, meant that we could make decisions fast. I remember signing this off late at night one night because we were working incredibly hard to get it over the line before the PERDA period started.
And so in one sense, it doesn't matter because the funding is there, but
Yeah.
in terms of understanding in particular where funding might come from in the future, it's perhaps quite important. Is
No,
the funding for all the schemes changes coming from the Department of Health and Social Care?
No, I don't actually think it is all that important. And that is because we are fully committed across the whole United Kingdom to ensure that these payments are there for the whole period in which they're needed. Now, Mr. Vineall has described the wiring behind how the funding reaches the devolved administrations. But ultimately, it all comes from the Treasury because the Treasury collect it from taxpayers. And we are committed to ensuring that this funding continues to flow. And the internal wiring of how that happens is a second-order question.
I appreciate it might be a second order, but nonetheless, what is the answer? Was this a bid in March to the Treasury for further funding, or was this money that's come from the Department of Health's existing funding?
Well, it came from the increase in the strengthening of the policy that we made in March came from the Department for Health budget because we had underspent elsewhere in the annual budget for last year.
And that includes
last financial year.
And that includes not just the changes for IBS, but for SIBS, NIBS, and WIBS as well, does it?
Yes.
I've been asked to ask a number of requests for clarification about how the changes in practice, the parity changes in relation to IBS, are going to work. I don't know the extent to which, Mr. Vineall, you're going to be able to answer these questions, but I'm just going to explore a couple of topics, and if not, it may be we're going to have to ask you to follow that up for us.
Yeah.
So if we just look, first of all, at the increase in payment, or what's described as, in terms of the key elements of change for the England Infected Blood Support Scheme are, and the first is annual payments for bereaved partners will be increased to an automatic 100% of their partner's annual payment to year one and 75% in year two and subsequent years, in line with the position in Scotland. Just so that I understand it correctly, is it accurate to describe it as an increase? Because there were no such payments previously, were there?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is an increase because we just didn't make those payments before. And one of the long-standing concerns, particularly of the bereaved, was that Scotland had these arrangements in place and we only had the £10,000 lump sum. So one of the big changes for us was to bring us into line with the position in Scotland of 100% year one, 75% year two, and Wales had a version of that, and Northern Ireland made some changes in March this year, which they're going to build onto the changes. So yes, it's effectively a new policy, and of course what it means is that income top-ups for bereaved people will no longer apply because, in a sense, they'll be incorporated into these new arrangements. So it takes the last significant part of means testing out of the EBS system.
And then still with the annual payments for bereaved partners, what's the logic or the rationale for backdating to April 2019, given that Scotland had this system since 2017?
Yeah, we took a policy decision that was the first time across the schemes that there'd been a significant change, which was a change in England. So it was correct to backdate all changes to that date that were about annual payments. And so I think it follows from an answer you've already given, but there'll be no element of means testing in relation to these payments. That's right.
And there'll be no bar, will there, on bereaved partners who've entered into new relationships?
I don't know the answer to that. I probably should do, but I'll take it away. That's a point of detail that we'll work through.
More generally, I've been asked by those representing you whether it would be a moment for you to have a break. I've actually only got probably another 10 minutes or so of
I'm happy to
questions.
crack on.
Let's keep going.
And then we have to have a break in any event and ask you to remain because there may be further questions suggested
Yeah,
by
that's
the
fine.
representatives. So
That's fine.
if you're happy to
Yeah.
continue,
Perfectly.
thank you.
But I'm very grateful for my team for giving us the opportunity.
You've answered the question.
Then just as a matter of general principle in relation to these changes, can you guarantee that no one will be worse off?
I can.
To what extent is means testing going to remain part of the scheme?
Those will just be for the child payments
And discretionary one-off grants?
and discretionary one-off grants.
In terms of the increased lump sum payments,
Yeah.
will those be available? So I'm talking here, sorry, the bereavement lump sum payments to the estates or surviving next of kin of those who've died previously.
Yes, because one of the rule changes that we're making with this is that it will be automatic to estates in the future, like it is in Wales, because Wales, in a sense, was the gold standard here. 10,000 automatic to the estate. So we need to introduce the to the estate and the automatic bit to the 10,000 that we already pay in England. So that's an example of where parity isn't just about finance, it's about some of the scheme rules. It doesn't apply across the board, but in this case it does.
And is that how far back does that lump sum payment go?
Well, it'll go back to the start of the scheme because what we said in the written ministerial statement was to all current scheme members.
So those who died and were never therefore scheme members will not benefit
That's
from
right.
this. What about the other lump sum payments, the increases in the other lump sum payments? Who will receive those?
Well, they still go back to 2017.
And so is it right to understand that in terms of financial payments, there will still be elements of disparity, historical disparity at least?
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect scheme at the moment.
Just in terms of some of the non financial, non-quantifiable elements of parity, the process in terms of the special category mechanism equivalents in Scotland and Wales are, as you know, Mr. Vineall, based not upon the clinical assessment that the SCM uses here, but upon self-assessment. Is consideration being given to changing the English scheme to one of self-assessment?
No, it isn't at the moment.
Why is that?
Because we think that the SCM works well in England. The SCM is quite a complicated process. You need a good evidence base, and you need people with expertise to review what healthcare practitioners submit with an application.
Is there any proposal for additional support to be made to a beneficiary who's progressed to HCV stage 2? Will they receive the additional £30,000 lump sum being paid to those with hepatitis stage 1?
Well, no, the changes as indicated there, it's at hepatitis C stage 1.
When is your best estimate of when these changes are going to be introduced and payments made?
Well, we said in the written ministerial statement by the end of the year and sooner if possible, and I understand that what Brendan Brown said this morning was that they would try and make the first payments in July. My understanding is I think they've got what they've got in their mind is a staging process to get the simpler to calculate payments out first and then do it in order of their administrative complexity. So, well, I can't speak for him, can I? Because I'm not allowed to. I don't think we should be tied to the date of July, but I do think we obviously want to get things out before the end of the year wherever we possibly can, but there will be a stepped process.
I think I correctly understood Mr. Hancock's earlier evidence and your own to indicate that there is no, if we leave aside Sir Robert Francis's compensation review, there is no current plan to consider extending the scheme to wider categories of the bereaved. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's right. There's no. We've made the changes as set out, and now, and they of course need to be administered and put in place. and then we need to hear the conclusions of Sir Robert and of course this inquiry.
And so I think it will probably follow from the answer you've given that in relation to those who provide long-term care for people who are infected with hepatitis C or HIV, so who are effectively providing gratuitous care, there's no current intention to expand the scheme to include them.
That's correct.
Okay, I anticipate that there will probably be a number of detailed questions that we might need to come back to you on in relation to some of the workings out of the changes. But I'll leave that for now.
To bring you up to speed, we're at the process of just working out those details ourselves.
Just before I move to my final set of questions, which is about the compensation framework, the evidence we heard from Wales and Northern Ireland this week about what their understanding is of how long this money is available for, I think suggested that there's the backdating element, and then it's here for another year, the funding. Is that right, or are these changes intended to be, and the funding available for these to be permanent features of the scheme going forward for all 4 schemes?
Well,
yes.
Yes.
This is permanent. I really want to underline that fact because you've asked it several times, and some of the paperwork, if you read it a certain way, implies that these schemes are going to end. That is not true. That's how in government we operate from spending review to spending review, and spending departments like mine are given a budget for that period, and then we're given a budget for the next period. That doesn't mean we're not going to continue a scheme. This scheme is permanent, and although I don't speak for Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, I'm absolutely certain that they will continue their schemes, and it's right that they should.
If we then just go over the page to the heading Compensation Framework, we see there from the Paymaster General the announcement of the appointment of an independent reviewer to carry out a study looking at options for a framework for compensation and to report back to the Paymaster General. Again, the evidence we've heard from other ministers suggested that this was not something that they had been cited on in advance, or at least not long in advance. Was this proposal something that the Department of Health was aware of?
This is a Cabinet Office lead, because the Cabinet Office rightly sponsor this inquiry, and as you can see, the Paymaster General takes a personal interest in trying to right these wrongs.
I understand that. Forgive me, my question's slightly different. I understood that this is a Cabinet Office lead and it's the Paymaster General who has made the announcement and is, as I understand it, commissioning the review from Sir Robert Francis. But was this an idea that the Department of Health was consulted on or was aware of in advance of the March announcement?
Yes, we were aware before the announcement, yes.
What expectation does the department have of involvement in the review?
Well, we'd expect certainly to be cited on the review. After all, this is technically many of the aspects that the review will cover are technically Department for Health and Social Care policy areas. However, what I'd say is that we have a very good relationship with the Cabinet Office on this, and I welcome the Paymaster General's interest in this area, and so I don't foresee any. Well, I think it's very good that we're having this review.
I'm conscious it's not a Department of Health led review, but do you agree, Mr. Hancock, that those who were infected and affected should be placed at the heart of the review process and have all necessary support and if necessary legal representation to enable them to participate in it?
Yes, that seems entirely reasonable to me. However, I would say that is a matter for Sir Robert. He's leading the review, and I'd want that to be done properly.
From the department's perspective, are you able to commit to publishing any submissions or representations that the department makes on the terms of reference of the review or the options for a compensation framework?
Well, we want to make sure that the terms of reference are written in consultation with those who are infected and affected, and I know that is something that that's in train, and that's why we haven't published terms of reference yet. We've published the name of the lead, and the terms of reference will follow, taking into account the views of those who are infected and affected.
But if the department makes submissions about either the terms of reference to Sir Robert or to the Cabinet Office, and if the department makes submissions about or provide evidence about the options for the framework for compensation, will the department commit to sharing that with the infected and affected?
By all means, I think this should be done completely in the open.
Final question, Mr. Hancock, for you. We can go back to the terms of the Paymaster General's letter to the Chancellor in September, if you like. But do you agree with the position she expressed in that letter and with the Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh ministers, that it is inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation?
I think that I'd go further than that. I think that should that be the outcome of this inquiry, then we will.
Those are the questions I'm currently proposing to ask, Sir, but we obviously now need to give, notwithstanding the late hour, the opportunity to legal representatives and core participants to suggest any further lines of questioning.
Yes, I took a decision, given that we started at 2:30, that we'd run through to make sure that you had a chance to get away sometime this evening. You will, but we'll need some time. How long do you think you might need?
I don't know. This is important evidence, and I know it's evidence upon which people have strong
I think
views.
what
Can we say
we'll
half
do is
an
we'll
hour?
say we'll take at least 20 minutes, but you let us know, and we'll let you both know if you need more time.
Thank you, sir.
But otherwise, everyone's free until 5:20, and I hope we'll start then, but we may not, and you'll understand why not, because the evidence does obviously raise quite a lot of issues which you may want to have asked questions about. Can I just say to the two of you, while I'm speaking, that what I say to all witnesses when there's a break is you're giving evidence. You may nearly have finished, but there are still questions to be answered. You must not discuss the evidence you have given or that you think you may yet be asked to give with anyone, whoever they are, but you can talk about anything else you like. Not before 5:20.